Hi, my name is Janice, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys about a project I was involved in during my summer internship. And the project that came out was the option for monitoring urban naturalization success. So a little backgrounder on this topic is most urban centers have tried to increase naturalization efforts in urban areas in the recent years, and City of Toronto is no different. They approximately have a canopy cover of 28%, and they have a goal to achieve 40% canopy cover by year 2050. And one of the teams striving towards this goal is the City of Toronto's Natural Environment and Community Program team, also known as NECP. And they plant at around 25 sites every year through volunteer-led plantings. And that means that approximately 50,000 trees, shrubs, and plants are planted through this program alone. Currently, there's no formal monitoring program for these volunteer plantings, some reasons being constrained resources and a lack of an appropriate analytical framework. However, there needs to be long-term data in order to understand tree survival and success, and this would help justify the investment in volunteer plantings through empirical evidence. So there's a couple challenges with this. First off is the monitoring program itself. With limited staff and funding, it's hard to carry out a monitoring program when there's no one to do it. Secondly, it's data management technology. They may not have the items required, and after collecting the data, what do we do with it? And thirdly, is field crew training. Not every person is suitable to go out into the field and collect data if they are not equipped with the knowledge. And secondly is the challenge of tree survival. The survival and planting rates of trees must outweigh the losses of tree death and removal for us to reap the benefit desires. And many trees planted don't last to provide the ecosystem services that we want. There needs to be a shift from the emphasis of counting the number of trees that go into the ground, but instead count the survival of the trees that last. So because these are volunteer-led plantings, engagement is a really important measure of success. NECP hosted 25 planting events in 2017, and in 2018 they hosted 33 events across the city, as you can see on the map here. This map illustrates the volunteer to planted area density, and most hover around 0.2, with Earl Bales being exceptionally high at 0.93. That's because they had multiple events there that year. And it's difficult to quantify the direct impact that stewardship events contribute to the community, but it's important to recognize that the trees planted during these events are worth more than the number of trees that are in the ground, because it allows communities to connect with the green spaces and foster a sense of stewardship and promote importance of environment. So the goal of my project was to develop a monitoring protocol to meet the needs of the NECP volunteer plantings, and I had three objectives. First was to assess the different suitable monitoring techniques in the context of urban naturalized areas. Second was to determine the ideal frequency for monitoring. And third was to offer recommendations based on funding, temporal limitations, and staffing available at the organization. So this is a brief chart of historical monitoring that had been done on naturalization sites at the City of Toronto before. So first there's the planting success survey, and then there's trees across Toronto, and then there's trees advocacy planting program. And in this matrix, we look at the duration, frequency, the season where it was surveyed, a brief description of the method, and then the attributes measured at each method. So I'm going to start with the planting success survey, which was done from 93 to 97. And this was done by going out into the field and counting every plant on the site, so it would be representative of all the sites available at the city. And from the reports I had available, there was a survival rate of 52% among all the sites, and this ranged from 8% to 94%. They were happy with this result because an average of 50% survival rate had been achieved, but because it solely looked at survival, sites with low survival may actually show stronger growth rates as the trees grow up and they develop into the canopy. It was noted that volunteer planting sites had a lower survival rate in comparison to contractor planted sites with an average of 41%. Since 1990 to 97, over 65 sites had been naturalized, and over 30,000 native trees and shrubs were planted through this program. In the 97 report, though, they did admit that they needed to redesign the monitoring program because it wasn't feasible to go out and count every single tree, shrub, and plant at every site. So the second was the Trees Across Toronto protocol, which occurred from 2004 to 2012, and this was used to evaluate community plantings in terms of survival and growth. And the first year of monitoring serves as baseline data for each site, and that it was intended to be a recurring monitoring program every 5 years during the fall or winter. And they used a randomization technique at each site selected with 6 survey plots, and within each plot, all of the plants were measured with detailed measurements with a lot of data. And the third one here was a tree advocacy planting program, which began in 2018, and this is a post-planting inspection intended to illustrate long-term survival through a more snapshot effect. It does this by doing a randomized quality and survival check. They sample approximately 10 to 20% of the site, and then they use this to extrapolate the full planting site's statistics. Within the plot that they're sampling, they make a count and tally of the total acceptable healthy plant material using a pre-established guideline. But none of these were suitable for any CP's needs, so we continued looking. We looked at local urban monitoring options. So one that was from the area was the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. They had a young tree and shrub monitoring and maintenance program, which involved tagging and visiting the sites later on. Ecological Monitoring Assessment Network had a shrub and small tree stratum biodiversity monitoring protocol, which is more like a best practices guide, which was a good jumping off point. There was the vegetation sampling protocol, which we heard about earlier, and guidelines from Tree Canada and Forest Ontario. So from all that we were reading, I put this all into a table with a brief description outlining advantages and disadvantages and creating 2 modified techniques. One was done with the help of Sean, and it was a modified YTMP technique where we would continue monitoring at different sites. And one was a modified VSP technique with the help of Danijela, which used a subsection of VSP, and we would be monitoring a transect and subplots instead of a whole 400-meter square. So with this in mind, we decided to go ahead and go with the modified VSP. So during the first field testing, we did this transect method by laying down the transect and then measuring all of the plants that fell within the subplot at 2 locations. One was Downsview Dells, which was planted in 2018, and the other was Lamoureux Park. So from the field testing results, the density calculation and the data we collected was a little misleading. For Downsview Dells, it was fine because that was the only year that that park was planted in, but Lamoureux Park had been planted in so many times that from the planting plan, the estimated plant density really should have been 8%, but what we actually calculated, there was a plant density of 42%. And this can be explained by something we call infill or polygon overlap. As you can see here in Heatherstone Park, this is a more extreme example. They planted here in 2010 and again in 2012 and 2014, and they just overlap each other again and again. And without any tags, it's impossible to know which plant belongs to which year. So going back to the drawing board, we had to tackle the issue of infill planting and overlapping polygons. And this ruled out retrospective monitoring because there was no definitive way to figure out what year which tree was planted. And this also meant that tagging was essential because we needed to know what year each plant was planted in. So in the next field testing, we used something similar to the YTMP method, and we went out and we tagged at 5 locations, and at these sites we tagged 20 plants each, and we used our collector to collect the data, and this allowed us to easily do it on the mobile device and use drop-down, and it was quite seamless and took about 40 minutes per site. And from the results, we can see here there were some issues. So from that protocol, because it wasn't completely ironed out yet, all of these sampled items were in the middle. It wasn't very representative of the entire polygon. So that was something we had to work out. And in the second one here in Warden Woods, you can see that some of the tagged items seem to fall outside the polygon. But when we were on site, we knew that this was part of the planting site, and it was the polygon that was the issue. So that was something we had noted and we needed to fix moving forward. So now that we think that this would be a good method, we had to think about the frequency. So Forest Ontario and Tree Canada recommended to monitor at year 1, 2, and 5. And because they plant at 25 sites per year, we wanted to monitor half the sites, so that would be 13 sites. And because there are 20 tags per site, that would be 260 tags each year. So by year 2024, they'd be tagging 260 new plants, revisiting the plants from 2023, revisiting the plants from 2025, and then the ones in 2019. Altogether, that's 1,040 plants they would have to sample at potentially 52 different sites on top of their current workload. So that wasn't exactly feasible, even when we scaled it down to just year 5, because that'd still be 520 plants at 26 sites during their planting season. So we met with the NECP team, and there was an idea to create a partnership to continue monitoring the future years through community nature clubs, environmental education groups, or even hiring a summer student to do the subsequent monitoring after the baseline had been collected by the staff. Staff were really interested in figuring out the overall percentage survival rate and species-specific survival rate, because they wanted to know if there was a difference between stewardship events, public plantings, and private planting events. And they wanted to know if the information collected could help them inform future restoration ideas, because it would lean towards the possible reasons of mortality. And lastly, they wanted planting survivalship to be represented by parks so the public could easily understand this information. So with our newfound knowledge and 2 field testing, we looked at all of the methods again, and now we ranked them again through simplicity, which is the criteria of success and how easy it is to understand for the everyday person. Second was cost effectiveness, which was a big factor, so it was multiplied by 2 because that was the limiting factor to this program. Reliability, which was how useful the information collected from the protocol would be. And lastly, objectivity, which is how it wouldn't be affected by interpreted bias and it could be repeated over time. And from this, we arrived that the methods from field testing number 2 seemed to have the best results. So that became the Planting Event Survival Audit, also known as PESA. As in here, you can see what adding a tagged plant looks like on our collector. You can see that we're looking at plant year 1, 2, and 5. And here's the species selected, the unique plant ID, the planting year and season, and initial state of the plant. And this is just one of the photos of the plants that were tagged during the testing. So for field testing number 3, we used this new protocol and we tried it out at a new bold planting site, and we revisited 3 of the sites from field testing number 2 to see how easy it was to find the tags and utilize the protocol. So some amendments to the protocol include adding more flagging tape, because as the weeds grew up, it was really difficult to find the tags. And we had to manually adjust some of the GPS points because depending on where we were, sometimes the receiver was up to 5-6 meters off, and we could see in the satellite imagery, it would tell us we were in a playground, but we knew we weren't, so we had to move the point. So the current version of PESA has a rationale, a health and safety component, a list of equipment needed to complete the monitoring, how to select sites prior to the planting season, how to conduct the initial planting, how to do the monitoring for years 1, 2, and 5, and a brief summary of analysis we could do with the results. So what's really exciting is that in 2019, the NECP team went out and deployed PESA at some of the fall planting events. And this allowed them to create planting polygons, which are much more reflective of the actual shape of the planting. And the plant tags are now more randomly distributed, as you can see here. One of the recommendations I had to display their information was to create an urban forest report card. It was inspired by the town of Oakville's urban forest health report card, and what it would include is a planting list, an overall percent survival per species, a health rating for the park, common observations, and the number of volunteers engaged. So here I had some data from the Trees Across Toronto site for 2005 Earl Bales planting. And here I put down the survival per species, the health rating, what was planted that year, and other common observations that were noted. So we want to know how PESA compared to international monitoring protocols. So in Italy, they have this long-term monitoring and survival protocol for urban plantations, which was more like a restoration. And they would monitor from years 6 to 24, and they had 40 permanent plots established in Rome with minimum tree requirements of 36 trees. So that would give them different area plots, but each one had a set number of trees, which was interesting. And China had a customized scale of success for different species. Granted, they only had 4 species to work with, but they recognized that they grow at different rates. So they measured the success individually per species, and it was either successful, struggling, or unsuccessful. And Sweden had this landscape level monitoring where 631 permanent sample plots were placed all over the country to monitor the growth and survival. So looking internationally, it seems like there's a trend for long-term and permanent plots. So for my recommendations, I recommend that in the short term, we continue to use the planting event survival audit at years 1, 2, and 5, and ideally up the number of tags to 10% of the individuals, and hopefully invest in more durable tags so that it will last to year 5. And then in the long term, perhaps transition some of these plots into permanent plots to be sampled to at least year 25, so we have a good idea of what the survival would be by then. I'd like to acknowledge all the help that I've had throughout this semester, namely my supervisors, Danijela and Lisa, and everyone else. Thank you.
Janice, great presentation.
Thanks.
I think it's remarkable that you've created a system from scratch through trial and error in a single season, created a workable, usable system that can actually be deployed in real life. So I think that's fantastic. The instant where you went from field testing 1 to field testing 2, I noticed that you switched over to Arc Collector. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit about why you decided to switch over to a mobile device to collect the data?
Yeah, so in the first field testing, we used pen and paper, and it was very tedious to go back on the computer afterwards and put the data collection in. And in between field testing 1 and 2, I had the opportunity to work with another department in urban forestry, and we conducted tree health surveys at Regent Park for about 2 weeks, and we used something called Fulcrum, which I think part of City of Toronto uses, and everything was a lot faster because it would load the point and you could upload it on the spot and there was no follow-up data collection to be done. So we were thinking time was a big concern, so this would help save time in the future for staff, especially if you had access to this.
Great work. My question is more about year 2 and later, and you know how weeds can be nasty, and how hard it would be to find the tags. And we know that, you know, if you use mulch, it will be fine for a little bit, but after a while there will be goldenrod up to your nose. So how those tags and how do you find them? How much effort does it take?
So in one of the reports that I looked at, they recommended that you went during early spring before all the weeds came in, and you could kind of tell when the buds were there. But I know that's not always possible. For that last field testing site we did, it was closer to probably early August, and you're right, they're very tall and nasty and they hurt. Other than the GPS thing, I couldn't really think of a better way. We were thinking of running transects, but then they wouldn't be standardized throughout the sites because our plots are such wonky shapes. You can't really run a transect uniformly through them. So that is a good point, and I'll think about it for the final draft.
Any other questions here? No? Thank you very much.
Thank you.